Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Speak and Feel English, the podcast where we explore practical ways to sound natural and confident in everyday communication. I am Mia, and joining me, as always, is my colleague Ethan. Today, we are discussing a word that appears simple at first, but actually carries a remarkable range of meanings in conversation. That word is would. Ethan, I feel this modal verb is one of those small tools that can dramatically improve how polite, expressive, and flexible someone sounds in English.
I completely agree, Mia. Learners often memorize the basic modal verbs early on, yet would tends to remain mysterious because it does not correspond to just one function. Instead, it operates across hypothetical situations, polite requests, reported speech, and even storytelling. When people truly understand how to use would, their communication becomes smoother and more nuanced, especially in professional or social contexts.
That is a great point. Perhaps we should begin by explaining that would is most commonly recognized as the past form of will, but in real usage, it does much more than indicate past future intentions. For example, when we say, she said she would call later, we are reporting a future action from a past perspective. The original sentence might have been, I will call later, but once reported in the past, it becomes would.
Exactly. This function appears constantly in conversations where we report what someone promised, predicted, or planned. It helps maintain the correct time relationship between events. Without it, the sentence may sound grammatically awkward or even confusing. Imagine someone saying, he said he will finish the report yesterday. That sounds incorrect because the reporting verb is in the past, so we naturally shift will to would.
Yes, and this introduces learners to the idea that would often signals distance. That distance may be in time, politeness, or reality. Let us start with distance in time, which is what you just described. When we talk about the future from the past point of view, would becomes the natural choice. This structure frequently appears in storytelling or when recalling plans made earlier.
Storytelling is a great example. Consider a narrative sentence like, every summer my grandparents would take us to the coast. In that sentence, would does not indicate the future at all. Instead, it describes a repeated action in the past. It's similar to saying used to, but with a slightly more narrative tone. It feels more vivid, almost like the speaker is reliving the experience.
I love that example because it shows how wood contributes to atmosphere. When someone says, we would sit by the fire and listen to stories, it paints a scene rather than simply listing past events. In spoken English, this usage is quite common when people talk about childhood memories or long-standing traditions.
Right, and this leads us into another key idea. Would often softens statements. It creates emotional or social distance, which makes communication sound less direct and more considerate. For instance, if I say, I want to ask you a question, it sounds straightforward. But if I say, I would like to ask you a question, it suddenly feels more polite and professional.
That distinction is essential in workplace communication. Many professionals rely on would to make requests sound respectful rather than demanding. Saying, would you send me the document, sounds cooperative, whereas send me the document might sound like an order. The modal verb transforms the tone of the sentence entirely.
Absolutely. In fact, many business emails depend heavily on this structure. Phrases like, I would appreciate your feedback, or I would be grateful if you could review this, are common because they signal professionalism and courtesy. They show awareness of the other person's time and effort.
And what's interesting is that would doesn't only soften requests, it also helps us talk about hypothetical situations, which is another major function we will explore in more detail later. For example, if I say, I would travel more if I had the time, I am describing an imaginary scenario rather than a real plan.
Yes, that conditional meaning is probably one of the most powerful uses of would. It allows speakers to discuss possibilities, dreams, and alternative realities. Without it, English would struggle to express those subtle distinctions between what is real and what is imagined. I think one of the most practical uses of would for everyday conversation is in making polite offers and invitations. This is where learners can immediately sound more natural, especially in social or professional settings. For example, instead of saying, "Do you want coffee?" someone might say, "Would you like some coffee?" The meaning is similar, but the second option feels warmer and more considerate.
That is such a useful comparison. The phrase, would you like, is almost universal in service interactions, meetings, and even casual hospitality. It signals that the speaker is offering something respectfully, giving the listener space to accept or decline comfortably. This emotional softness is what makes the phrase so effective.
Exactly. And we see the same pattern in invitations. If I say, "Will you join us for dinner?" it sounds like I am expecting an answer tied to future plans. But if I say, "Would you join us for dinner?" it becomes more of a courteous invitation, almost like I am acknowledging that the other person may have their own schedule or preferences.
That distinction is subtle but important. Would often suggests that the speaker understands the situation may not happen, which makes the invitation feel less pressured. In other words, it reflects awareness of possibility rather than certainty. That is why it appears frequently in professional networking events, meetings, and formal gatherings.
Another area where would becomes incredibly useful is in polite requests, especially when combined with phrases like mind or be willing. For instance, saying, "Would you mind explaining that again?" sounds cooperative and respectful. It acknowledges that the request involves the listener's time or effort.
Yes, and that structure also reduces the risk of sounding demanding. Compare explain that again with would you mind explaining that again? The second option makes the interaction collaborative rather than authoritative. This is particularly helpful in workplaces where maintaining positive relationships is essential.
I also notice that would frequently appears in suggestions. Imagine a team discussion where someone says, "I would suggest reviewing the data before making a decision." That phrasing presents the idea without imposing it. It allows others to evaluate the suggestion rather than feel obligated to follow it.
That is a great observation. Using would in suggestions communicates humility. It implies that the speaker is offering a perspective rather than declaring a rule. This tone is extremely valuable in leadership roles, where guiding discussion respectfully can influence outcomes more effectively than giving direct commands.
Absolutely. Another conversational pattern worth mentioning is when would is used to express preferences. For example, someone might say, "I would rather start early than stay late." This structure allows the speaker to communicate their preference clearly while still sounding thoughtful and balanced.
I like that example because it shows how would can make opinions sound less confrontational. If someone simply says, I prefer to start early, it sounds factual, but I would rather start early adds a sense of reflection, as though the speaker has considered alternatives. It makes the statement feel more conversational and less rigid.
And we can expand that pattern into conditional preferences as well. For instance, "I would rather stay home if the weather turns bad." Here, would works with the condition to show that the preference depends on circumstances. This type of sentence appears constantly in everyday planning conversations.
That brings us nicely to another important function, expressing willingness. When someone says, I would help if I could, they are communicating readiness combined with limitation. The modal verb signals intention, while the conditional clause explains the obstacle. This helps avoid sounding dismissive.
Yes, and it often conveys empathy. If a colleague says, "I would join the meeting, but I have another commitment," it sounds far more considerate than simply declining. The sentence shows that participation was considered even if it is not possible.
That is a key point. Would often communicates thoughtfulness. It suggests that the speaker has imagined the alternative scenario, even if reality prevents it. This psychological nuance is why the word is so powerful in maintaining polite, cooperative relationships.
Another conversational context where we see this effect is advice. Instead of saying, you should check the numbers again, someone might say, I would check the numbers again. That phrasing sounds less judgmental because the speaker is presenting their own approach rather than instructing the listener directly.
Exactly. It frames the advice as a personal strategy rather than a correction. This is particularly helpful in workplaces where maintaining positive relationships is essential.
So, if we look at all these examples together, offers, invitations, requests, suggestions, preferences, willingness, and advice, we can see a clear pattern. Would is not just a grammatical tool, it's a social tool. It shapes how messages are received emotionally.
That is a great way to put it. The modal verb does more than express possibility. It shapes tone, relationship, and intention. Understanding that social dimension helps learners move beyond grammar and into real conversational fluency. I think it is time to focus on one of the most structurally important uses of would, which is in hypothetical and conditional sentences. This is where the modal verb truly shows its power, because it allows speakers to talk about imagined situations rather than real ones.
I agree completely. Conditional sentences are fundamental in English, and would plays a central role in what we often call the second conditional. This structure typically describes situations that are unlikely or unreal in the present. For example, if I say, if I had more time, I would learn another language. I'm not saying I actually have the time. I am imagining a different reality.
That example perfectly illustrates the concept. The condition, if I had more time, is expressed in the past form, but it does not refer to the past. Instead, it signals that the situation is hypothetical. Then, would appears in the result clause to show what could happen in that imagined scenario.
Yes, and this structure is incredibly useful in everyday communication because people constantly discuss possibilities, dreams, and alternative outcomes. Imagine someone planning their career path and saying, I would start my own business if I felt ready. That sentence expresses both ambition and uncertainty at the same time.
That dual meaning is what makes conditional sentences so expressive. They allow speakers to reveal not just what they want, but also the barriers they perceive. The modal verb acts almost like a bridge between reality and imagination.
Another interesting aspect is how would helps soften speculation. If someone says, that plan will fail, the statement sounds absolute. But if they say, I think that plan would fail, it sounds more like a reasoned opinion. The modal verb signals that the statement is based on judgment rather than certainty.
That is such an important difference, especially in professional discussions. Using would can make analytical statements sound thoughtful rather than overly confident. For instance, in a meeting, someone might say, this approach would reduce costs in the long term. That phrasing invites discussion instead of closing it.
Exactly. It communicates reasoning rather than prediction. And this leads us to another conditional pattern involving advice. People often use would to discuss what they might do in another person's situation. For example, if I were you, I would review the contract carefully. This construction allows the speaker to give advice while still respecting the listener's autonomy.
I love that structure because it shows how grammar and psychology intersect. Saying, you should review the contract may sound direct, but if I were you, I would review the contract, frames the advice as a personal reflection. It feels more collaborative and less prescriptive.
And that tone is extremely valuable in leadership, mentoring, or consulting roles. It suggests experience without sounding controlling. In many ways, would helps transform advice into shared reasoning.
Another important use appears when we discuss imagined reactions. For example, someone might say, I would be surprised if they declined the offer. The speaker is predicting a response, but with caution. They're acknowledging uncertainty rather than claiming knowledge.
That is a great observation. This structure appears frequently in analysis, forecasting, and strategic planning. It allows people to express expectations without sounding overly certain. This balance between confidence and flexibility is essential in professional communication.
We also see would in past hypothetical situations, often when people reflect on choices. For instance, I would have taken that opportunity if I had known about it. Here, the speaker is imagining a different past. This structure lets people discuss regret, missed chances, or alternative histories.
Yes, and that form, would have plus a past participle, is crucial for discussing unreal past outcomes. It's common in reflective conversations, interviews, and even storytelling. Someone might say, "We would have finished earlier if the system had worked properly." It explains what prevented a different result.
What I find fascinating is how this structure helps people analyze experiences. It allows them to evaluate decisions, identify obstacles, and consider lessons learned. In that sense, would becomes a tool for reflection, not just grammar.
That is true. It supports critical thinking in conversation. And it also appears in negotiations. Imagine someone saying, "We would consider extending the deadline if the proposal meets our criteria." That sentence signals openness while maintaining conditions. It communicates possibility without commitment.
That is a perfect example of how would can manage expectations. It shows willingness, but keeps the outcome dependent on circumstances. This makes it extremely useful in business discussions, where clarity and flexibility must coexist.
So if we step back and look at these patterns together, we can see that would is central to discussing possibilities, advice, predictions, regrets, and negotiations. It helps speakers move beyond simple facts and into interpretation and imagination.
Exactly. It allows communication to operate in layers where reality, possibility, and reflection can all coexist within a single sentence. And mastering that ability can significantly improve how natural and persuasive someone sounds in English.
I think it is important now to talk about how would appears in everyday conversational habits, especially in reported speech. This is one of those areas where native speakers use the structure automatically, yet learners sometimes hesitate because they are unsure how tense changes should work.
That is true. Reported speech often requires shifting verbs to reflect the perspective of the speaker at a later time. When someone originally says, "I will send the file tomorrow," and we report it later, we typically say, "She said she would send the file the next day." The modal verb helps maintain logical consistency in the timeline.
Exactly. Without that shift, the sentence could sound confusing or grammatically mismatched. Reported speech is not just about repeating words, it's about reflecting how time and intention change once the statement is retold. Would acts as a bridge between the original promise and the later report.
And this structure appears constantly in professional contexts. Imagine summarizing a meeting and saying, "The manager confirmed that the team would review the proposal." That sentence clearly indicates that the commitment was made earlier but relates to a future action from that earlier point.
Yes, and it also conveys reliability and accountability. Using would signals that something was expected or intended. It helps capture not just what was said, but what was planned or promised.
Another conversational habit involving would appears in polite narratives about behavior. For example, people sometimes say, "He would always arrive early and organize the room." In this case, would describes a habitual action in the past, similar to what we discussed earlier, but here it emphasizes character or personality traits.
That is a great example. When someone says she would always help everyone before finishing her own work, it highlights a consistent pattern rather than a single event. This use often appears in storytelling, interviews, or speeches when describing someone's qualities.
It is interesting how this narrative would often adds warmth to the story. It feels more descriptive than simply listing past actions. It gives the impression that the speaker is recalling repeated scenes rather than isolated facts.
I agree. And speaking of conversational patterns, we should also mention how would appears in common expressions that soften opinions. For instance, people often say, I would say this is our best option. The phrase I would say signals that the speaker is offering a considered opinion rather than an absolute judgment.
Yes, that phrasing invites dialogue. It implies that the speaker is open to other perspectives. Compare that with this is our best option, which sounds definitive. Adding would creates space for discussion.
We see the same effect in phrases like I would imagine, I would think, or I would expect. Each of these expressions signals thoughtful speculation. They allow the speaker to present reasoning without claiming certainty.
Those expressions are extremely useful in professional communication, especially when analyzing data or forecasting outcomes. Saying, I would expect the results to improve next quarter sounds measured and analytical, whereas a direct prediction might sound overly confident.
Another everyday pattern involves using would in gentle refusals. For example, instead of saying, I cannot attend, someone might say, I would love to attend, but I have another commitment. This structure expresses appreciation while still declining.
That is such an important social function. It shows respect for the invitation and acknowledges the opportunity before explaining the limitation. The modal verb helps maintain positive relationships even when the answer is no.
Exactly. And we often see this in written communication as well. Many formal responses use would to balance politeness with clarity. For instance, we would be happy to collaborate in the future, but we cannot proceed at this time. The sentence sounds cooperative even while delivering disappointing news.
That balance between courtesy and honesty is essential in professional environments. Would helps soften the emotional impact of the message while keeping the meaning clear.
Another conversational use appears when people describe imagined reactions in storytelling. Someone might say, you would not believe how quickly the project changed direction. Here, would draws the listener into the narrative, almost inviting them to share the speaker's surprise.
Yes, that is a wonderful example of how the modal verb can add dramatic emphasis. It makes the listener feel involved in the experience rather than just hearing about it. This storytelling function often appears in presentations and speeches as well.
So when we look at these conversational habits together, reported speech, narrative description, softened opinions, polite refusals, and storytelling emphasis, we see that would is deeply integrated into everyday English. It's not just a formal grammatical tool, it's part of the rhythm of natural conversation.
That is exactly right. Mastering these patterns allows speakers to sound thoughtful, respectful, and expressive all at once. It transforms communication from functional to engaging. As we reach the final part of our discussion, Ethan, I think it would be helpful to bring everything together and reflect on why this small modal verb carries so much importance in everyday English communication. Throughout our conversation, we have explored how would functions across politeness, storytelling, hypothetical reasoning, reported speech, and professional interaction.
I agree, Mio. One of the most striking things about would is that it does not simply convey meaning, it shapes tone. It allows speakers to present ideas with flexibility rather than rigidity. Whether someone is offering advice, making a request, or discussing a possibility, the word introduces a sense of openness that encourages dialogue.
That openness is essential in both personal and professional environments. For example, when someone says, I would recommend reviewing the proposal, they are sharing expertise without sounding forceful. The modal verb transforms what could be a directive into a collaborative suggestion.
Exactly, and that collaborative tone often determines how messages are received. A sentence like, you should revise this section, may sound corrective, whereas I would revise this section feels supportive. The difference may seem subtle, but it has a significant impact on relationships and teamwork.
Another key takeaway is how would helps speakers navigate uncertainty. It allows them to express expectations or predictions without claiming absolute knowledge. Saying, this strategy would likely improve efficiency, communicates analysis while still leaving room for discussion or new information.
That balance between confidence and humility is incredibly valuable. In many situations, especially those involving decision-making or leadership, sounding open to input encourages trust. Would becomes a linguistic signal that the speaker respects complexity rather than pretending to have all the answers.
We also discussed how would supports reflection. When people look back on experiences and say, I would have chosen differently if I had known more, they are analyzing the past constructively. This structure allows them to acknowledge lessons learned without sounding defensive.
Yes, and that reflective quality makes the modal verb especially useful in professional growth conversations, performance reviews, and mentoring discussions. It creates space for learning rather than blame.
I think another practical insight for listeners is that mastering would is not about memorizing rules alone. It is about noticing how native speakers use it to manage relationships, express ideas gently, and describe possibilities.
The more someone listens for these patterns, the more naturally they will begin to use them. That is a great point. Language fluency often comes from recognizing patterns in context. If listeners pay attention to phrases like I would suggest, would you mind, I would expect, or I would have, they will start to see how the word adapts to different situations while maintaining its core function of expressing distance or possibility.
And once that pattern becomes familiar, using it in conversation becomes almost automatic. It starts to feel less like a grammar exercise and more like a communication tool.
Exactly. Ultimately, would helps speakers sound thoughtful. It signals that they are considering alternatives, respecting others, and acknowledging complexity. That combination is what makes communication effective in real life, not just grammatically correct.
So, if we were to summarize the essence of today's discussion, we could say that would allows English speakers to move beyond simple statements and into nuanced expression. It enables politeness, imagination, reflection, and collaboration, all within a single word.
That is a perfect summary. And for listeners who want to improve their fluency, the best approach is to start incorporating the word into small, everyday sentences. Try using it when making requests, offering opinions, or describing possibilities. Over time, it will become a natural part of your speaking style.
Absolutely. Language development is often about small adjustments that lead to big improvements. Adding one modal verb in the right place can transform how your message sounds and how it is received.
And with that, I think we have covered the topic thoroughly.
We certainly have. Thank you to everyone for listening to this episode of Speak and Feel English. We hope this conversation has given you practical insight into how to use would more confidently in your own communication.
And if you found this discussion helpful and would like to hear more conversations like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel and explore our other podcast episodes for more guidance on improving your English skills.
Until next time, keep practicing, keep listening, and keep speaking with confidence.